And I move on to the backbench motion on the international status of Taiwan. It gives me huge pleasure to invite Blair McDougall to move.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Backbench Committee for granting this debate. This is the first time I've stood in this chamber to back the democratic people of Taiwan, but I want to acknowledge those who have done work on this issue over many years, in particular the member for Chingford and Woodford Green, my former neighbouring MP Stuart MacDonald. I'd also like to start off by recognising the Minister's long-standing commitment to human rights of people in this region, and indeed your own, Madam Deputy Speaker, as well. I'd also like to welcome into Parliament today the Deputy Representative Director and the Assistant Director of the Political Division from the Taiwanese Representative Office, who are in the gallery to observe this debate, which carries important bearing on our strong and vibrant relationship with Taiwan. Madam Deputy Speaker, the detail in the motion for this debate may seem esoteric, but diplomatic technicalities on an issue as fraught as the status of Taiwan could have far-reaching consequences for the entire world. And we do need to have this debate now rather than later. I think back to the frenetic last-minute activity ahead of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the emergency flights full of anti-tank weapons, the hastily drafted sanction regimes, the fruitless shuttle diplomacy. And Ukraine stands as a reminder that it's best to form policy on a crisis before the crisis emerges. The incremental changes to the status quo made by authoritarian regimes are likely a prelude to more overt measures, and that the best time to deter an aggressor is before their confidence grows. It's not possible to overstate, I think, the risks of a conflict over Taiwan. Leaving aside the humanitarian costs and the geopolitical consequences of another democracy being attacked by a larger authoritarian neighbour, the economic pain would be felt in every single household in this country. Because around 90% of the world's large container ships pass through the Taiwan Strait once a year. Taiwan produces 2/3 of all semiconductors and well over 90% of all advanced microchips. It's estimated that a conflict would cost the global economy not less than $2.5 trillion. But that estimate is calculated by the Rhodium Group using only shipping data. Bloomberg, on the other hand, puts the figure at a massive $10 trillion US dollars, about 10% of global GDP, and they estimate that that is conservative. The scale of the risk is why this is a debate that's taking place not only in this chamber, but in parliaments around the world. And I'd like to put on record my thanks to the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China for their assistance, and to note that through their work, parliaments in Australia, the Netherlands, Canada and the European Parliament have all expressed their opposition to the distortion of UN Resolution 2758. And I gratefully give way to the right honourable gentleman.
I'm grateful to the Honourable, first of all, for achieving this debate, and secondly, for giving way. But the comparison point is really important. The figures he's given out for what would happen should the Taiwan be blockaded or even invaded, are worth relating back to the Ukraine effect. When Russia invaded Ukraine, we had a hit of about 1 trillion on global economy. He's talking about 9 or 10 times that effect on the global economy. So they are our neighbour rather than a far and distant land. Do you agree?
Absolutely. And while, of course, first and foremost in our minds should be the impact on people in Taiwan of any crisis, it would be felt by our constituents and their cost of living and everything that happens in this country. So it's right that this is a worldwide debate because, Madam Deputy Speaker, in addition to the military incursions into Taiwanese territory, the cyber attacks, the disinformation, the interference with shipping and aircraft, those things that make the headlines, and I should say I welcome the new government's expressions of concern over aggressive moves in the Strait. But this needs to be a global conversation because the People's Republic of China is engaged in an aggressive worldwide diplomatic strategy, especially across the global south. It's a strategy that aims to secure international acceptance for its expansionist one China principle. That is to say that Taiwan is a part of a single China and that the PRC is the only legitimate government of Taiwan, denying Taiwan's democracy any distinctive international status. Of course, Resolution 2758 does not mention Taiwan at all. It doesn't address in any way the political status of Taiwan. It does not establish the PRC's sovereignty over Taiwan. It is silent on the participation of Taiwan in the United Nations and its agencies. And importantly, it has no force of impact on us as sovereign nations in terms of the relationships we choose to have with Taiwan. So the current strategy by Beijing is a distortion of international law, but it's also at odds with the long-standing policy of the United Kingdom. And it's essential that this is contested and that this debate offers the Minister and the new government the opportunity to make clear that the UK opposes this effort from the Communist government to rewrite history or to unilaterally decide the future of Taiwan. Now, debates around Taiwan are famously full of symbolism. Which flag is flown, what nomenclature is used, which seemingly synonymic words cause offence. So it would be easy to write off discussions about the interpretation of Resolution 2758 as yet another finer detail that distracts from a bigger picture. But that would be a mistake, because this is not pedantry from Beijing, this is predation. Chairman Xi watched the near-unanimous diplomatic disapproval of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, and he's seeking to reduce the chances of a similar chorus of condemnation towards any move against Taiwan. If the PRC's position is accepted, that the UN resolution in question endorses their sovereignty over Taiwan, then they will use that consensus at a later date to argue that any future coercion of Taiwan through arms or other means, whether blockade or annexation, would be legal. And similarly, any acceptance of Beijing's interpretation will also be used to argue that moves to prevent such coercion by Taiwan's democratic supporters is unlawful. So this is not a technical issue, but another source of increased risk for conflict across the Taiwan Strait. And I would ask the Minister whether she can confirm today, as has been reported, whether any assurances have been given to the PRC that the UK will not seek to counter internationally the PRC's efforts on the One China principle, and whether promises have been privately made that we will not make the case for UK policy with third-party nations, namely our position that Taiwan's status is undetermined. And I wonder, does the Minister recognise that any UK government acquiescence in the idea that the status of Taiwan is an internal matter for the PRC alone risks giving legal cover to any future aggressive acts? And would she recognise that distorting Resolution 2758 to pursue the exclusion from international organisations of Taiwan, a democratic self-governing people, undermines the legitimacy of the international rules-based order, not least as it appears to be inconsistent with the treatment of other disputed territories? And I ask the Minister, will the UK advocate for meaningful Taiwanese participation in all international organisations for which statehood is not a prerequisite? Madam Deputy Speaker, there have been moments of crisis in the past in the Strait of Taiwan that have flared up and subsided, in particular in 1996 and 2000 after presidential elections. But three things have changed since then that should make us more concerned. The first is that China is far more heavily armed. Already possessed of the largest naval fleet in the world, Beijing has been adding to it the equivalent of the entire Royal Navy every 2 years. They will soon have the largest air force in the world. The second change is that people on both sides of the strait have grown apart. The Taiwanese have more of a sense of their own identity, and their democracy is now deeply embedded, while China's populist nationalism has grown, and the PRC, which was hardly ever a free and open society, has moved even further in an authoritarian direction from Xinjiang to Tibet and to Hong Kong. Chairman Xi previously proposed to apply the one country, two systems approach to Taiwan. However, the systematic removal of Hong Kongers' civil liberties means that any promise from the mainland to maintain the freedoms that Taiwan enjoys could not be trusted. We know Beijing does not keep its promises. And the third change, if we're honest, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that the West has been found wanting. We have been less than united, less than determined in our defence of democratic allies and democracy around the world. Xi has learnt from Putin's years of slowly boiling the frog, dividing Western opponents from each other, manipulating our populations and operating in the grey zone. He has learned that a gradual increase in aggressive acts avoids a strong strategic response from the West. So that mixture of Chinese armament, growing nationalism, increasing authoritarianism and Western weakness is a potentially deadly combination. Indeed, the military exercises and provocations around Taiwan are a recipe for unintentional disaster. Last year, there were more than 1,700 occasions where PRC military aircraft deliberately entered the air defence identification zone of Taiwan. PRC jets turn away when they are just minutes away from Taipei. During exercises, we see Taiwanese and PRC vessels in standoffs on the edge of Taiwan's nautical buffer zone. Meanwhile, we do not have agreed red lines around Taiwan with other like-minded countries, and worrying ambiguities remain. For example, a maritime and air blockade is normally classed as an act of war, but that isn't clear in this case because of Taiwan's ambiguous state. Can the Minister assure the House that the legal status of a blockade around Taiwan is something that's being looked at? Because I worry that we could have a situation where governments use this ambiguity as an excuse for inertia in the event of a crisis. And will the Minister take this opportunity to say that a maritime and air blockade around Taiwan would be a red line for this government? On so many occasions during the Cold War, catastrophe was avoided due to essential de-escalation protocols that prevented the misinterpretation of either side's intentions. And I'd be interested in the Minister's assessment of whether sufficient procedures exist between the military commands of Taipei and Beijing, as in such a febrile and nationalistic atmosphere, a mistake could easily be misunderstood as deliberate escalation, and control of volatile public opinion could easily be lost. Let us not forget, as was said earlier, who paid the price for the collective failure of the international community to deter Putin's aggression. It was first and foremost the Ukrainian people, but it was also ordinary working people who found themselves around the world with unaffordable bills. And if Bloomberg is correct, escalation across the strait would be, as the Right Honourable Gentleman opposite said, 5 times worse than the economic contraction post-Ukraine. We simply cannot allow that to happen. Madam Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, we talk a lot about protecting the status quo when we're talking about Taiwan, but we have to recognise the PRC is already actively working to change that status quo. But Beijing has not paid any price for this. Xi's diplomatic offensive hasn't been met with a commensurate effort from Western democracies. As they isolate Taiwan within international institutions, we haven't increased our engagement in response. And above all, there's been no sanction for the constant military intimidation or the grey zone attacks. And I recognise, of course, that careful diplomatic language is needed on this issue. But we live in a world where free and open societies are retreating in the face of authoritarians, regimes who no longer recognise the old order or even international boundaries, and who are seeking to recreate the world in their image. So I don't expect the Minister to depart from the delicate, long-established language that has defined the UK position towards Taiwan since diplomatic relations were established with the PRC. And this motion doesn't ask for such a departure. But I hope that asking the Minister to put on record the government's concern at Beijing's distortion of international law around Taiwan, together with the editing of historic UN documents by Chinese officials, is not seen as an outlandish or hawkish request, but merely the least we can do when confronted with such troubling behaviour. And finally, with all diplomatic language aside, this debate is an opportunity to acknowledge a truth, that Taiwan is not China in one important way, that no amount of economic, military or diplomatic bullying by Beijing can obscure. And it is this, that the people of Taiwan are free and the people of China are not.
That's right.
Now more than ever, we must stand with democracies and against dictatorships. We must stand up for the freedoms that we claim are universal, regardless of where people live in the world. And we should stand with the democracy of Taiwan.
The question